The day Frederick Dalton dropped to his knees in the dirt behind his barn and prayed out loud to the open Texas sky was the same day Ruth Sawyer's wagon wheel cracked clean in half on the old Laredo Road, not 2 miles from his property line. Frederick was not a man given to prayer. He was a man given to action, to calloused hands and early mornings, and the kind of stubborn silence that had kept him upright through more grief than most men ever survived. He had buried his wife, Clara, 3 years prior in the spring of 1874, beneath the old cottonwood tree at the far edge of his land in Haskell County, Texas. He had dug that hole himself, lowered the plain pine box himself, and filled the earth back over her himself, because his nearest neighbor was 12 miles east, and because some grief is so personal that the presence of another human being feels like an intrusion on sacred ground. He had then walked back to the house, washed his hands in the basin on the porch, and fed 3 little girls their supper without once letting his voice crack. That was Frederick Dalton. 34 years old, broad across the shoulders, with dark brown hair that had begun salting at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from limestone, and eyes the color of the sky just before a storm rolls over the flatlands. He ran a cattle operation on 400 acres, kept 6 horses, grew enough corn to last a winter, and raised his daughters with a combination of tenderness and discipline that would have impressed any schoolteacher. He did everything right. He did everything hard, and for 3 years he had done it entirely alone, without complaint, without asking a single living soul for help. But 3 years had worn him down to something that was starting to crack at the seams, the way old leather cracks when it has been left in the sun too long without any oil. His eldest daughter, Maggie, was 9 years old and had begun to take on a seriousness in her eyes that no 9-year-old should carry. His middle daughter, June, was 7 and had started waking in the night from dreams she would not describe, pressing herself against Frederick's side in the big bed until morning. His youngest, Pearl, was only 5 and barely remembered her mother at all, which was perhaps the saddest thing of all, because she sometimes called Frederick Mama by accident and then went bright red with shame and confusion. On the afternoon of September the 3rd, 1877, Frederick finished mending a section of fence on the north pasture, walked back to the barn, and stood there in the hot amber light of late afternoon listening to the silence of a house with no woman in it. He could hear Maggie inside, reading aloud to her sisters from the worn Bible their mother had kept. He could hear June's occasional questions and Pearl's small fidgeting sounds. He stood there with his hat in his hands, and something in him finally broke open, quietly and completely, like a dam that gives way not with a roar but with a slow, certain surrender. He went down on his knees in the dirt, right there behind the barn where no one could see him, and he pressed his hat over his heart and tilted his face toward the sky, and he said, out loud in a voice that was rough from disuse and tight with emotion, "Lord, I am asking for help. I do not know how to ask for it from another person. I reckon you know that about me, but my girls need something I cannot give them, and I am not too proud to say so anymore. I need help. I am asking for it. Whatever you see fit to send, I will be grateful for it." He stayed there on his knees for a long moment after that, the Texas wind moving through the tall grass around him, the sun going amber and enormous toward the horizon. Then he stood up, dusted his trousers off, put his hat back on his head, and went inside to start supper. He did not expect an answer by morning. He certainly did not expect one to knock on his door. Ruth Sawyer had been traveling alone for 11 days when her wagon wheel gave out on the Laredo Road. She was 28 years old, with dark red hair pinned up beneath a practical bonnet, a face that was handsome rather than pretty in the classic sense, with strong cheekbones and brown eyes that were quick and observant and entirely unfrightened by the world. She was 5 feet and 4 inches of competence and determination, and she had been a schoolteacher in Abilene for the past 4 years, and before that she had been the eldest daughter of a family of 7 in Missouri, which meant she had been cooking and managing and organizing and teaching and caring for others since she was old enough to stand at a stove. She was not running from anything. She was not desperate or destitute. She had simply received a letter 3 months prior from the school board of Larson's Creek, a small but growing settlement in Haskell County, Texas, offering her a position as their new school teacher at a salary of $30 a month plus lodging, and she had decided that it sounded like exactly the kind of new beginning she wanted. She had sold her furniture, packed her personal belongings into the back of a borrowed wagon, said goodbye to the friends she had made in Abilene, and set out. She had been doing perfectly fine right up until the moment the right rear wheel of the wagon hit a deep rut in the road and splintered with a sound like a rifle shot. Ruth pulled the horse to a stop and climbed down and walked back to look at the damage, and she stood there with her hands on her hips and assessed the situation with the same practical clarity she brought to every problem in her life. The wheel was not repairable. She was on a stretch of road with flat land in every direction. The sun was maybe 2 hours from setting, and she had no idea how far the next town was. She had a horse, a bedroll, 3 days of provisions, and a considerable amount of common sense. She unhitched the horse from the wagon, secured her most important belongings in a saddlebag that she draped across the horse's back, and looked out across the land. To the north, she could see what looked like a column of smoke rising in the lazy, domestic way that suggests a cooking fire rather than a disaster. She squinted at it, calculated the distance at something under 2 miles, and made her decision with no drama whatsoever. She led the horse north, across the dry grass, following the smoke. The smoke was coming from the chimney of Frederick Dalton's house. It was just past 6 in the evening when Frederick heard the knock at his front door. He was standing at the stove stirring a pot of beans, and Maggie was setting the table with the careful concentration of a child who takes her responsibilities seriously, and June was chasing Pearl around the kitchen table in a game that was about to turn into an argument. Frederick wiped his hands on a rag and crossed to the door and pulled it open. The woman standing on his porch was holding the bridle of a buckskin horse with one hand and a leather saddlebag with the other, and she was dusty from the road and her bonnet was slightly askew, and she had the kind of direct, unflinching gaze that Frederick had not seen on a woman since Clara, and it stopped him entirely for just a moment, the way a man stops when he steps from a dark room into bright sunlight. "Good evening," she said, and her voice was clear and steady. "I apologize for arriving unannounced. My wagon wheel gave out on the Laredo Road about 2 miles south of here. I'm a schoolteacher traveling to Larson's Creek, and I was hoping you might be willing to offer shelter for the night and perhaps some guidance toward the nearest town in the morning. My name is Ruth Sawyer." Frederick Dalton stood in his doorway and looked at this woman who had knocked on his door the same afternoon he had prayed for help, and the coincidence of it hit him in the chest like a fist, though he kept his expression careful and quiet. "Frederick Dalton," he said, and stepped back from the door. "Come in, Miss Sawyer. You are welcome here." Ruth Sawyer stepped into the house, and Frederick Dalton's 3 daughters stopped what they were doing and stared. Maggie stared with the measured gravity of a 9-year-old who has learned not to react to things too quickly, because reaction sometimes leads to disappointment. June stared with her mouth slightly open and her eyes wide and immediate. Pearl, who was 5, walked directly across the kitchen and grabbed the hem of Ruth's skirt with both fists and looked straight up at her and said, "Are you staying forever?" Ruth looked down at the small, serious, red-cheeked face of Pearl Dalton, and something in her chest turned over in the warmest possible way. "Pearl," Frederick said, his voice carrying the gentle warning of a man who has said a child's name in that particular tone many times before. "It is quite all right," Ruth said, and she crouched down so that she was at Pearl's level, which was a thing that took some people years of teaching to learn to do instinctively, and she said, "I am staying tonight, certainly. Beyond that we shall have to see." Pearl considered this with the focused seriousness of a philosopher. "Okay," Pearl said, and went back to chasing June. Frederick stood in the middle of his kitchen feeling like the ground beneath him had shifted slightly on its axis, and he was not entirely sure whether that was a good thing or a terrifying thing, and he decided it was probably both. Ruth Sawyer was not a woman who allowed herself to be a burden, and so before she had been in Frederick Dalton's house for 10 minutes, she had assessed the state of the kitchen with a practiced eye, noticed that the beans on the stove needed stirring, and that the cornbread in the pan was about 30 seconds from burning, and had quietly taken over the remainder of supper preparation with such natural efficiency that Frederick found himself sitting at his own kitchen table being handed a cup of coffee he had not asked for, feeling oddly displaced and oddly relieved in equal measure. "You do not have to do that," he said. "I know I do not," Ruth said pleasantly, pulling the cornbread from the oven with a cloth. "But it seems wasteful to let it burn when I am standing right here." "That is fair," Frederick said. They ate supper together at the kitchen table, all 5 of them, and it was the strangest and most complete thing Frederick had felt since Clara died. Ruth Sawyer talked to his daughters like they were people worth talking to, which they absolutely were, but which not everyone remembered to do. She asked Maggie about what she was reading and listened with genuine attention to the answer. She laughed at June's elaborate story about a lizard she had found behind the water trough that morning. She let Pearl sit beside her and lean against her arm without making it awkward or pulling away. After supper, Ruth helped clear the table and insisted on washing up. Frederick dried the dishes and stacked them, and they worked together in the kitchen in the particular quiet that develops between people who are discovering with some surprise that they fit rather naturally beside each other. "Larson's Creek schoolteacher," Frederick said, handing her a dry plate. "They have been looking for someone for nearly a year. The last one lasted 3 months before deciding the frontier was not for her." "I am not easily discouraged," Ruth said, and there was no boast in it. It was simply a fact she was reporting. "No," Frederick said, "I do not imagine you are." He set his daughters up in the loft for bed, going up the ladder with each of them in turn to tuck them in and listen to their prayers, the way he did every night without fail. Pearl's prayer, which she delivered with her eyes squeezed shut and her small hands pressed together, included a specific request that the lady with the red hair stay for a while, and Frederick sat at the edge of her little mattress and felt that hit him somewhere behind his sternum. "Sleep now, Pearl," he said softly, and kissed her forehead. He came back down to find Ruth Sawyer standing at the front window of the house, looking out at the dark Texas land, and there was something in the line of her shoulders and the way she stood there quietly without restlessness that told him she was a woman comfortable with the bigness of open country, comfortable with silence, comfortable in her own skin. "I have a cot in the storeroom," Frederick said. "It is not elegant, but it is clean." "It sounds perfectly wonderful," Ruth said, and she meant it. He showed her to the storeroom, made sure there was a blanket and a lamp, and said good night at the door. "Mr. Dalton," Ruth said before he turned away. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him for a moment with those direct brown eyes. "Thank you, you did not have to open your door." "You needed help," Frederick said simply. "That is what doors are for." He went to bed that night and lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about the specific way the evening had felt. The house fuller than it had been in 3 years. The sound of a woman moving around the kitchen. The extraordinary, ordinary completeness of it. And he felt guilty for thinking about it. And then he felt guilty for feeling guilty. Because Clara was 3 years gone, and he was still a living man with living daughters and a life still in progress. He did not sleep for a long time. Ruth Sawyer woke before dawn, which was her habit. She built the fire back up in the stove, found the coffee, and had a pot ready before the sun had properly risen. She also found the pantry and assessed its contents with a schoolteacher's organizational eye and made a mental note of what was there and what was notably absent. Frederick came into the kitchen at first light and stopped in the doorway at the sight of her standing at his stove with coffee poured and waiting. "You are up early," he said. "I have always been," she said. "Coffee is ready." He sat down and wrapped his hands around the mug, and the warmth of it traveled up through his palms, and he looked at this woman who had appeared at his door the evening before and thought, with a calm certainty that surprised him, that she was the most capable person he had met in years. They talked over coffee, quietly so as not to wake the girls, and the conversation moved naturally and with ease between practical things and larger things, the way conversation does between people who are genuinely interested in each other. He told her about the ranch, about the cattle operation, about the long winters and the dry summers, and the way the land was hard and beautiful in equal measure. She told him about Abilene, about the school there, about the 4 years she had spent teaching the children of cowboys and merchants and settlers, and how the work had felt important and right every single day. "Why Larson's Creek?" he asked. "Abilene is a more established town." Ruth was quiet for a moment, her hands around her coffee mug. "Because I wanted something that was still becoming itself," she said finally. "A place where the work matters more, where there is more need." Frederick looked at her. "That is an unusual reason." "I am not sure it is," she said. "I think most people with a true vocation feel that way about it." He thought about that for a long time after, the word vocation, the idea of a calling, the sense that some people know what they are for and go toward it without apology or hesitation. After breakfast, which Ruth cooked with the girls underfoot and laughing, Frederick hitched his best horse to his wagon and drove out to the Laredo road to assess her damaged wheel. He looked it over carefully, crouched beside it, ran his hand along the broken spokes, and confirmed what she had already known. It was beyond repair. He could drive her into Calverton, which was the nearest town with a wheelwright, a distance of about 8 miles. "I can leave tomorrow morning," he said. "If you are willing to wait a day." "I have nowhere I must be until Monday," Ruth said. "Today is Thursday." He nodded. "Then you will stay through Friday at least." She helped him that afternoon in a way that was both practical and somehow companionable. She mended harness leather while he worked on the fence he had not finished the day before, and they called back and forth, occasionally across the distance between them on topics that ranged from the weather to the price of beef, to the question of whether Haskell County would ever get a proper schoolhouse built, which it did not yet have, and which was a matter of some urgency if Ruth Sawyer was going to fulfill her new position. "There is a building," Frederick said, pushing a fence post deeper into the ground. "It was built by the community 2 years ago. Rough timber, 2 windows, a wood stove. Not beautiful, but it stands." "Then it is everything it needs to be," Ruth said, not looking up from her stitching. He watched her for a moment from across the fence line. This compact, self-possessed woman sitting on a flat rock in the September sunlight with harness leather across her knees. And something in him went very still and very warm, the way the air goes still just before something significant happens. The afternoon moved into evening again, and supper again, and the girls again, this time with June showing Ruth a drawing she had made of the horse and Pearl demanding a story before bed, which Ruth provided without hesitation, sitting on the edge of Pearl's mattress in the loft, and telling a story about a girl who could speak to ravens that was so vivid and inventive that all 3 Dalton daughters were silent with attention all the way through it. Frederick listened from below, at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, and the sound of Ruth Sawyer's voice moving through the quiet house was the most peaceful thing he had heard in years. On Friday morning he drove her into Calverton. The town was small but functional, a general store, a livery, a saloon, a sheriff's office, a church, a post office, and the wheelwright's shop on the south end of the main street. Ruth arranged for her wagon wheel to be replaced, which would take until the following morning, and Frederick offered to drive her back out to the ranch for another night rather than have her sleep in the wagon on the road. "I do not want to impose," Ruth said. "You are not imposing," Frederick said, with a directness that surprised even him a little. "My daughters will be very disappointed if you do not come back." Ruth looked at him, and there was a slight curve to her mouth that was not quite a smile but was something just as meaningful. "Is that the only one who will be disappointed?" Frederick Dalton, who was not a man who was often caught off guard, was very briefly and completely caught off guard. "No," he said after a moment, and his voice was level and honest. "It is not." Ruth looked at him for another long beat, and then she turned and said they should see about some supplies while they were in town, because she had noticed his cornmeal bin was getting low. And Frederick followed her into the general store, feeling like a man who has just stepped off a cliff and found, to his great surprise, that the falling felt a lot like flying. In Calverton, they were not entirely invisible, two adults of unmarried age walking together through a small town. Mrs. Hargrove, who ran the general store with her husband, watched them over the counter with the particular sharpness of a woman who catalogues such things. Old Pete Carver, who sat outside the livery on a nail keg most of every day, nodded at Frederick with a slow grin that carried an entire commentary within it. Frederick ignored all of this with the dignified patience of a man who has been single in a small community long enough to be accustomed to the attention that comes with it. Ruth, for her part, appeared entirely unbothered. She moved through the general store with a list she had made in her head, selecting what was needed with the efficiency of someone who shops for a household rather than for herself, and she paid for the items she selected from her own purse before Frederick could step in, which made him frown slightly. "Those are for your household," he said. "They are for your household's larder, which I have been eating from," she said pleasantly. "It is only right." He could not argue with the logic. He paid for the rest, and they carried the supplies out to the wagon and drove back through the afternoon heat to the ranch, and the conversation between them on that drive was the easiest and most natural conversation Frederick had had with another adult in longer than he could clearly remember. She asked him about Clara. She did not tiptoe around it or approach it sideways, the way most people did, dancing around the subject as if speaking of the dead might shatter him. She asked simply and directly, and because of that directness, he found he could answer with more ease than he had expected. "She was from Georgia originally," he said. "Came west with her family when she was 16. I met her when I was 23 and she was 22. We married in the spring of 1865. She was the most practical woman I ever knew except for when it came to wildflowers. She would not let me plow under any patch of wildflowers, no matter how inconvenient the location, said they had as much right to be there as the corn." Ruth smiled at that, a full, real smile that reached her eyes. "She sounds wonderful." "She was," Frederick said. "She was also stubborn as a post and had a temper that could strip paint, and I loved her completely." He paused. "She died of fever. It came fast and we could not get a doctor in time. By the time the wagon got there, she was already gone." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry," she said, genuinely. "I know," he said, and he could tell that she meant it, which was the difference between condolence as performance and condolence as fact. "Do you have family?" he asked. "In Missouri," she said. "My parents are still living and two of my brothers. My sister married a man in Kansas City. We write often." She paused. "I was engaged once, 7 years ago. He was a good man, but we wanted different things from life, and we were honest enough with each other to admit it before rather than after. He married someone else and seems very happy. I am glad for it." 7 years is a long time to be unmarried by choice in the West, Frederick said. "The West is full of men looking for a woman to do their laundry," Ruth said, without bitterness. "I was not interested in being useful in that particular way until I found someone I was interested in being useful to in every way." The frankness of that statement settled between them like something placed carefully on a table. Frederick kept his eyes on the road. "And have you," he asked, "found that?" Ruth Sawyer was quiet for 3 full seconds, which was unusual for her. "I am beginning to wonder," she said. They did not look at each other. The horse moved steadily through the September afternoon, and the land stretched golden and enormous around them, and Frederick Dalton felt something shifting inside him that was like the first creak of a door long held shut beginning, very slowly, to open. That evening, after supper and after the girls were in bed, they sat on the front porch of the house together. Ruth had a cup of tea and Frederick had coffee, and the sky was enormous and packed with stars the way the Texas sky gets on clear September nights, which is to say it was the most stars any sky has any right to contain. "I need to ask you something," Frederick said. "Then ask it," Ruth said. "When you get to Larson's Creek," he said, and his voice was careful and deliberate, "will you be settled there? Is that where you intend to stay?" Ruth turned her head to look at him. "Why?" "Because Larson's Creek is 11 miles from here," Frederick said, "and I would like to know if that is not too forward, whether you might be open to company, or correspondence, or both." He paused. "I am not practiced at this. I should tell you that plainly. I have been alone a long time, and I have grown somewhat clumsy with the language of it." Ruth Sawyer looked at this man sitting in the lamplight from the open doorway, his long hands wrapped around his coffee mug, his expression careful and honest and quietly hopeful in a way that she found more moving than any elaborate declaration she had ever been offered in her life. "You are not clumsy with it at all," she said. "You are just honest. There is a difference." She looked back at the stars. "Yes, Frederick, I am open to both." The way he exhaled when she said that was a very quiet, very private sound. The kind a man makes when he realizes something he has been bracing against is not going to hurt after all. Saturday morning, they drove back into Calverton and collected the repaired wagon, and Frederick hitched Ruth's horse back to it himself, checking every connection with the thoroughness of a man who wants to be certain that what is carrying someone important is sound. The girls said goodbye to Ruth at the road, all three of them. Pearl cried, which she did with her whole face and no attempt at dignity whatsoever. June hugged Ruth around the waist and held on for a long moment. Maggie shook Ruth's hand very formally and then, when Ruth pulled her into a hug instead, held on just as fiercely as June had. Ruth stood back and looked at all three of them, and her eyes were bright. "I will come to visit," she said. "As soon as I am settled in Larson's Creek I will come and find you all, I promise." Pearl wiped her face with the back of her hand. "Promise on stars," Pearl said. This was, Frederick understood, Pearl's highest form of vow. Ruth smiled. "Promise on all of them," she said. She climbed up onto the wagon seat, gathered the reins, and looked at Frederick where he stood beside the road. He had his hat in his hands. He was standing the way he stood when something mattered to him, very still and very straight. 11 miles, he said. 11 miles, she agreed. She clicked to the horse and the wagon moved off down the road and Frederick stood there and watched it go, and Maggie slipped her hand into his right hand and Pearl grabbed his left, and June stood pressed against his side, and the four of them watched Ruth Sawyer's wagon roll south along the Laredo Road until the distance took it. "Papa," June said. "Yes," Frederick said. "I like her," June said. "So do I," Frederick said. His voice was steady and quiet. "So do I." The following 2 weeks were the longest Frederick had experienced since the weeks after Clara's death, though they were different in character. Those had been weeks of hollow grief. These were weeks of something that felt more like anticipation straining against patience, a feeling he was entirely unaccustomed to and slightly annoyed by and secretly grateful for in a way he would not have admitted to anyone. He wrote her a letter on the Sunday after she left. He sat at the kitchen table after the girls were in bed, and he wrote it with the same careful deliberateness he brought to everything, and it ran to 2 pages, which surprised him, because he had not thought he had 2 pages of things to say. He talked about the ranch, and a fence repair that had gone badly and then well, and a steer that had escaped through the north gate and been found 3 fields over looking deeply unconcerned about the trouble it had caused. He told her that Pearl had decided to rename her wooden doll Ruth, and that he had not corrected her because he lacked both the heart and the argument to do so. He said that he hoped Larson's Creek was everything she had hoped it would be, and that the schoolhouse was at least mostly upright, and that he found himself looking forward with considerable interest to seeing her again. He read it back once, decided it was honest without being excessive, and sealed it. Ruth's letter arrived 12 days later. She had begun teaching on her first Monday in Larson's Creek, and had 17 students of various ages and abilities, ranging from a 6-year-old boy who already knew his letters to a 15-year-old girl who was learning to read for the first time, and was doing so with a determination that Ruth found both heartbreaking and extraordinary. The schoolhouse was indeed mostly upright. The community had provided her with a small room at the back of the general store, which was drafty but had a good stove, and she had made it comfortable with her own things. She had already identified 4 things that needed doing in the schoolroom and had begun doing 2 of them herself rather than waiting for someone else to get around to it. At the end of the letter, in handwriting that was slightly more careful than the rest, she had written, "I think about the evenings on your porch more often than is probably practical, but I have always been the kind of person who does not pretend that practical is the only thing worth being." Frederick read that last paragraph 3 times. He wrote back the same day. Their correspondence over the following weeks developed into something that was, by the second month of it, the most substantive thing in either of their lives outside of their respective daily work. They wrote about everything, the serious and the trivial, the philosophical and the immediate, the past and the future. Frederick told her things he had not told anyone in years, not because he had been concealing them, but because there had been no one to tell them to. Ruth wrote with the kind of clear, honest intelligence that made every letter feel like a genuine encounter, a meeting of actual minds. He drove to Larson's Creek on a Saturday in October, 6 weeks after she had left his porch. He told himself it was because he needed to see about a piece of farming equipment that Larson's Creek's general store had that Calverton did not, which was true but also not, in the larger sense, the reason. He arrived in the early afternoon. He found the schoolhouse first, which was empty on a Saturday, and stood looking at it from the road. It was small and plain, as he had said it would be, 2 windows and a door and a wood stove pipe coming out the roof, but there was a wreath of dried flowers on the door that had not been there before, and the front step had been swept clean, and through the window he could see that the interior was organized and bright with the specific intentional warmth that Ruth Sawyer brought to any space she occupied. He found her at the general store, in conversation with the storekeeper's wife about the possibility of getting more primers for the older students. She saw him before he said anything, turned in that particular way people turn when they feel someone looking at them from across a room, and her face did a thing that was very brief and very readable, a flash of undisguised, unguarded pleasure that she did not manage to contain before it showed. "Mr. Dalton," she said. "Miss Sawyer," he said. "Farming equipment," she said. "Among other things," he said, and she smiled at that, the full, real smile that went all the way to her eyes. They walked together through the small town of Larson's Creek in the October afternoon, and she showed him what she had already managed in 6 weeks. The schoolhouse with its dried flower wreath, the arrangement she had made with the storekeeper's wife to borrow books for the older students, the path she had identified that would be a safer way for the children on the eastern edge of the community to reach the school during winter when the road flooded. She told him about her students with the particular affection of a teacher who has already identified each child as an individual, their specific strengths and needs, and the things that made them each remarkable in their own way. Frederick listened, and as he listened he felt the thing inside him that had been cautiously opening since the night she arrived at his door open a little further, with greater confidence now, the way a door swings wider when someone leans into it. "How are the girls?" Ruth asked, when they stopped at the edge of town and looked out over the open land. "Maggie has read through the New Testament and is making serious inroads on Psalms," Frederick said. "June caught another lizard and has established a small zoo of sorts behind the water trough. Pearl renamed her doll." Ruth turned to look at him. "I heard about that in your letter." "It is still named that," he said. She looked out at the land for a moment. Then she said carefully, "Will you bring them to visit the school? I would like them to see it, and I suspect Pearl might like to meet some of the younger students." "I will," Frederick said. "Next Saturday if the weather holds." "Good," she said, and then with the same forthright honesty that had characterized everything about her since the first moment she appeared on his porch, "I have missed them." "They have missed you," Frederick said. He looked at her directly. "I have missed you as well." The October air was cool between them, and the light was the particular quality of late autumn on the Texas plains, golden and slightly melancholy and very clear. "Frederick," Ruth said. "Yes," he said. "I think we should be honest with each other about what this is," she said, not looking at him, looking at the horizon. "Because I am not a person who does things by halves, and if I am going to do this, then I am going to do it properly, which means being clear about what I mean." "I appreciate that," Frederick said. "Be clear." She turned and looked at him. "I have been a practical woman my entire life," she said. "And practical women are sometimes accused of not having romantic feelings, which is incorrect. I have them. I am simply not careless with them." She paused. "But I am not afraid of them either. And what I feel when I am with you, and what I have felt since the night I knocked on your door, is something I am not interested in pretending is ordinary. It is not ordinary." Frederick Dalton stood in the October afternoon and looked at Ruth Sawyer and felt the last of whatever had been held shut inside him for 3 long years simply let go. "No," he said quietly, "it is not ordinary in the least." He reached out and took her hand, carefully, the way a man handles something he recognizes as valuable. Her fingers were strong and warm, and they closed around his with no hesitation. They stood like that for a long moment, looking out at the enormous Texas sky, two people who had arrived at each other by the most roundabout and improbable of routes, and who were standing together now as if they had always intended to end up exactly here. The following Saturday, Frederick loaded all 3 daughters into the wagon and drove to Larson's Creek. The girls were dressed in their best, which was Maggie's doing. June had brought the best of her lizard drawings as a gift, which was June's way of expressing significant regard. Pearl had brought her doll, the one named Ruth. Miss Sawyer met them at the schoolhouse and showed them around with the same bright thoroughness she brought to everything. And Pearl walked around the room touching all the desks with reverent small fingers. And June immediately identified which desk was the best one for lizard drawing and claimed it on the spot. And Maggie stood at the front of the room looking at the world map pinned to the wall with an expression of deeply serious geographic interest. Ruth had arranged for 2 of her younger students to also be there that day, a 6-year-old boy named Thomas and his 7-year-old sister Ada, whose family lived close to the school. Pearl was immediately enchanted with both of them, and within 15 minutes was engaged in some sort of elaborate imaginative game in the schoolyard that appeared to involve the doll named Ruth as a royal ambassador from a distant kingdom. Frederick watched his youngest daughter shrieking with laughter across the schoolyard with Thomas and Ada, and then looked over at Ruth standing beside him, watching with that particular smile of hers, the one that was warm and knowing and entirely hers. "She is happy," Frederick said. "She is wonderful," Ruth said. "They all are." He looked at her, she looked at him. The thing between them was so plain and so clear now that there was almost nothing left to say about it except the practical things, and so Frederick said the most practical and most important of them. "Ruth," he said, "I have something I want to ask you." She turned to face him fully, and her expression was very steady and very open. "I am 34 years old," he said, "and I am not a man who goes about things in a roundabout way when a direct way is available. So I am going to ask you directly whether you would consider marrying me. Not immediately, if you need time. But I want it to be understood that my intentions in this direction are serious and fully formed, and that I am asking because this is what I want, not because I think it is what ought to happen or what would be convenient." Ruth Sawyer was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that Frederick's heartbeat became a matter of some concern to him. "That is a very well-constructed proposal for a man who claims not to be practiced at the language of these things," she said. "I practiced it on the drive over," he admitted. She laughed, a real laugh, and it was the best sound he had heard in years. "Yes," she said, "I will consider it. I am, in fact, already considering it quite favorably." She looked at him with those direct, honest brown eyes. "I have been a single woman by choice, as I told you. But the thing about choosing to be single is that it is only meaningful if you remain willing to change your mind when the right reason presents itself." She looked out at the girls in the schoolyard, Pearl and her new friends, Maggie now asking Thomas's older brother something earnest and specific, June sketching rapidly in her notebook. "And I appear to have found a very compelling collection of reasons." Frederick took her hand again, there in the schoolyard of the Larson's Creek School in the clear October light. "Then we will take it properly," he said. "I will come every Saturday. We will continue to write. I will do this correctly." "That sounds exactly right to me," Ruth said. And so they did. The winter of 1877 in Haskell County was cold but not brutal, and Frederick Dalton drove to Larson's Creek every Saturday without exception, arriving in the late morning and staying through supper, sometimes bringing the girls and sometimes coming alone when the girls were at a neighbor's care. He and Ruth walked and talked and sat together in the small community church for Sunday services when he stayed overnight in the room at the Hargrove family's spare room. And they got to know each other in the layered, genuine way that people who intend a permanent thing must get to know each other. He met her world in Larson's Creek. The Perkins family who ran the general store, the pastor and his wife who were good people with strong opinions, the parents of her students who ranged from wildly enthusiastic to indifferent about their children's education, and all of whom Ruth treated with the same steady dignity. He saw her teach once on a day when he arrived early and stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse before she saw him, and watched her move through the room from child to child with a patience and warmth and precision that was so naturally and completely her that it made something ache in him beautifully. She came to the ranch on several weekends, when a neighbor's daughter could stay with her room, and Ruth could be collected on a Friday and returned on a Sunday. She cooked with Maggie and taught June to identify 3 new bird species from a book she brought from the school, and spent long Saturday mornings baking with Pearl in the warm kitchen, while Frederick worked in the barn and pretended he was not listening to the sounds of his youngest daughter's joyful conversation drifting through the walls. In December, Ruth received a letter from the school board thanking her for her work and asking if she intended to renew her contract for the following year. She showed it to Frederick on one of her weekend visits to the ranch, and they sat at the kitchen table together after the girls were in bed and talked about it, which was really talking about the larger question underneath it, the question of what came next and when. "I intend to finish the year," Ruth said. "I will not leave those children mid-year. It would not be right." "I agree completely," Frederick said. "The school year ends in May." "Yes," Ruth said. He looked at her across the table. "Ruth." "Yes." "I would like to marry you in June," he said. "If that suits you, if you are ready, I am entirely and without reservation ready." Ruth put both of her hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment, and then she looked up at him with an expression that was unguarded and bright and very fully herself. "June," she said. "Yes, June suits me perfectly." He covered her hands with his, both of them, and they sat like that at the kitchen table in the lamplight with the cold December wind at the windows and the quiet house around them, and the future sitting right there between them, warm and fully formed and entirely real. He gave her his mother's ring on Christmas Eve. He had driven to Calverton 2 weeks before and had the gold band cleaned and the small garnet reset by the jeweler there, and he had carried it in his coat pocket for 14 days. He gave it to her on the porch of the ranch house on Christmas Eve with all 3 of his daughters arranged in the doorway behind them, which was partly accidental and partly the result of Maggie's quiet organizational genius. He did not go down on one knee in the dirt this time. He stood in front of her on the cold porch and took the ring from his pocket and held it out on his palm and said, "I told you in October that my intentions were serious and fully formed. I am hoping you will make them permanent." Ruth looked at the ring in the lamplight, and then at him, and her eyes were bright. "Frederick Dalton," she said, "I will absolutely make them permanent." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it for a moment on her hand, and then she stepped forward and put her arms around him in the cold December air, and he held on to her with both arms, solid and sure and completely certain, for the first time in 3 years, that everything was going to be all right. Pearl, from the doorway, made a sound of pure triumphant delight that was only slightly muffled by June's hand over her mouth. Maggie stood beside her sisters in the doorway and watched her father hold this woman in the cold light, and the gravity that had lived behind her eyes for 3 years was not gone, exactly, because Maggie Dalton would always be a serious person, but something in it softened and shifted into something better, something closer to peace. The winter moved forward, and the community of Larson's Creek was, naturally, very interested in the news of Miss Sawyer's engagement to the Dalton widower out on the North Road. There was no malice in the interest, mostly genuine goodwill, because Ruth had made herself a real part of the community in 4 months, and the Dalton family was respected, and most people who saw the two of them together could see plainly that this was a genuine thing rather than a practical arrangement. There were 1 or 2 voices that offered the opinion that it was fast, a woman who had only arrived in September agreeing to marry a man she had known 3 months. Ruth was aware of these opinions and was not particularly troubled by them. She had been practical her entire life, which meant she was also thoroughly clear-eyed about human nature, and she knew that sometimes a thing that looks fast from the outside has been centuries in the making at the level of character and readiness, and that she and Frederick Dalton had been ready for each other for a great deal longer than 3 months. They were both adults of significant life experience. They knew their own minds. In February, a matter arose that tested both of their characters and the community's goodwill in a more significant way than gossip. Haskell County had been seeing an increase in tensions along the land corridors to the north, where the cattle drives moved through, and where the question of land rights was a constant source of dispute. 3 families of Comanche descent who had been living peacefully on the eastern edge of the county for nearly a decade had been pressured by a group of new settlers to vacate land they had been on for years, using legal arguments that were, Frederick privately believed, entirely manufactured. He had met the elder of these families, a man named Gray Horse, years before when Gray Horse had helped him locate 2 stolen horses, and he respected him. The situation was ugly and complicated, as land disputes always were, and it was made uglier by the fact that there were men in the community willing to use intimidation, alongside legal argument, which is to say that Gray Horse's eldest son came to Frederick one cold February morning asking for help, because their fence had been cut and their cattle scattered, and 3 of their horses were missing, and the sheriff in Calverton had not yet responded to their complaint. Frederick went. He rode out that same morning, and Ruth, who was at the ranch for the weekend, watched him go and then spent the morning thinking very carefully about what her position on the matter was, because she was going to be a member of this community as Frederick's wife, and a member of this community as the schoolteacher, and she wanted to be sure her position was clear. By the time Frederick returned in the early afternoon, with the 3 horses recovered and the matter temporarily stabilized, Ruth had already decided that she would write to the school board explaining that she had several students of Comanche and mixed heritage in her class, which she did, and that any attempt to remove their families from the county would directly harm the school's enrollment and the educational mission she had been hired to fulfill, which it would. Whether the let her help she never knew for certain. But the situation resolved without further serious escalation over the following weeks. The new settlers backed down from their most aggressive positions, and Frederick told Gray Horse what Ruth had done, which Gray Horse acknowledged with a brief nod and a very direct look. "She is a good woman," Gray Horse said. "Yes," Frederick said, "she is." "Your wife?" Gray Horse asked. "Come June," Frederick said. Gray Horse nodded again with the same economy. "Good," he said, which was as comprehensive an endorsement as Frederick could have asked for. Spring arrived in Haskell County the way it always did, with violent storms and mud, and then suddenly everything green and gold and enormous with possibility. Ruth finished the school year in the last week of May with a closing ceremony that the entire community attended, at which several of her students demonstrated what they had learned, and at which Pearl Dalton, who was there with her father and sisters, sat in the front row and watched with an expression of focused reverence normally reserved for church. Ruth stayed at the Dalton ranch after the school year ended, with the storekeeper's wife acting as chaperone for the few days before the wedding, which the community accepted as perfectly reasonable. She spent those days doing what she always did when she was in a place she intended to stay. She made it more itself. She rearranged the kitchen to a slightly more efficient configuration, which Frederick allowed without comment because it was, objectively, better. She planted a kitchen garden in the patch of ground behind the house that had been idle, with seeds she had brought from Abilene. She mended the curtains in the girls' loft. She read with Maggie every evening, the two of them at the kitchen table with serious faces and occasional quiet discussion, and she helped June organize the lizard drawings into a proper illustrated journal that June treated as one of the most important documents she had ever owned. With Pearl, she continued the stories. Every evening before bed, Ruth sat on the edge of Pearl's mattress and told a story, always original, always vivid, and Pearl listened with her small, serious face, and her hands folded in her lap like she was in church, which was the highest attention Pearl could offer. Frederick watched all of this from various distances and experienced a feeling that was complete and large and did not fit neatly into any single word. So he settled for grateful, because that was both the simplest and the truest part of it. They were married on the 14th of June, 1878, in the Larson's Creek Church, by the pastor who had got to know them both over the winter and who performed the ceremony with genuine warmth and a brevity that Frederick privately appreciated. Ruth wore a dress of blue wool that she had made herself over the winter evenings, and it was not elaborate, but it suited her completely, the way everything she wore suited her, because she wore everything with the confidence of a woman who is entirely comfortable in her own self. Frederick wore his good suit, which Maggie had brushed meticulously, and he stood at the front of the church and watched Ruth come down the short aisle toward him, and the feeling he had was not the terrified, overwhelmed feeling of a young man getting married for the first time, because he was not a young man and this was not his first time. It was something steadier and deeper and more fully chosen than that. It was the feeling of a man who has walked a long way through hard country and has arrived at a place he recognizes as home. They said their vows clearly and directly, looking at each other, and when the pastor said, "You may kiss your bride," Frederick Dalton kissed Ruth Sawyer Dalton in front of the entire community of Larson's Creek and several families from the surrounding area, and it was a kiss of the kind that leaves very little ambiguous about the feelings involved, which is to say it was thorough and genuine, and caused Pearl Dalton, in the front pew between her sisters, to emit a small sound of complete happiness. The community provided a celebration after, in the church hall, with food and music, a fiddle player and a man with a mouth harp, and dancing that went until past dark. Frederick danced with each of his daughters in turn, Pearl standing on his boots the way she always did when they danced, June doing her own interpretation of the steps that bore only a loose relationship to the actual music, Maggie dancing with the concentrated effort of a girl learning to do something new. Then he danced with his wife, and they moved together in the warm light of the church hall with the music around them and the community around them and his daughters watching from the side, and Ruth's hand in his was warm and real and exactly where it belonged. "How do you feel?" Ruth asked, close to his ear as they danced. "Like a man who got considerably more than he prayed for," he said. She pulled back slightly and looked at him. "You prayed for this?" He had not told her about the prayer, the afternoon behind the barn, the knees in the dirt, the request sent out into the open sky. He told her now briefly, quietly, with the music going around them. Ruth Sawyer Dalton looked at her husband in the lamplight of the church hall, and her expression was something he could not entirely name, moved and amused and deeply, genuinely touched all at once. "I will have you know," she said, that my wagon wheel broke in a perfectly explainable way due to the condition of the road. I have no doubt, Frederick said. However, she said, I did stop that morning before I set out and ask for something, not specifically. I am not a specific sort of person spiritually. I just asked for the right thing, whatever that was. Frederick looked at her. And did you find it? He asked. Ruth Sawyer Dalton looked up at her husband in the middle of the dance and smiled, slowly and completely. I knocked on a door, she said, and it opened. The summer of 1878 was the best summer Frederick Dalton could remember in years, and it had the quality that the very best periods of life sometimes have, where you are aware, even while you are inside it, that this is something you will want to hold on to forever. Ruth took up the life of the ranch with the same practical, all-in thoroughness she brought to everything. She was not a passive presence in the household but an active one, working alongside Frederick in the ways she could, managing the house and the kitchen garden with the attention of someone who takes the growing of things seriously, and continuing her teaching not in the formal sense but in the constant, organic way she had always taught, because she could not spend an afternoon with children without them learning something. She wrote to the school board in late summer about resuming her position in the fall. They agreed that she could continue to teach while living at the Dalton Ranch, as the 11 miles was manageable, and that Maggie and June, who were now 10 and 8, could attend her school, which would solve the problem of their education that had been a source of quiet concern to Frederick for some time. So in September, Ruth drove the wagon to Larson's Creek on Monday mornings, with Maggie and June beside her on the seat, and returned on Friday afternoons, and Frederick spent those weeks managing the ranch and keeping Pearl, who was too young still for the full week away, and who spent her days following her father around with absolute dedication, and telling him at length about the stories Ruth had told her most recently. It was a good arrangement, practical and workable, and it lasted through the fall semester and into the spring of the following year. By that spring, Ruth knew she was expecting. She told Frederick on a Tuesday evening in April, sitting on the porch in the early spring air, just the two of them, the girls already in bed. She told him directly and without preamble, which was her way. He was very still for a moment. Then he put his arm around her and pulled her close and pressed his face against the top of her head and did not say anything for a long time because he did not need to. "How are you feeling?" he said finally. "Very well," she said. "I am strong, Frederick." "I intend to be fine." "You intend to be fine," he said, and she could hear that he was almost smiling. "I do," she said firmly. "And I intend for you not to treat me like I am made of glass because that would be enormously irritating." "I will try," he said. "Try hard," she said. He laughed, a real laugh, warm and full, the kind that the girls turned over in their sleep to hear when it came through the walls, because their father's full laugh was one of their favorite sounds in the world. He told the girls that weekend. Maggie received the news with a seriousness that was also underneath a deep brightness. June immediately began a list of names. Pearl considered the matter for a long moment and then announced that if it was a girl, it should be named after a star, and if it was a boy, it should be named after a horse she admired in the North Pasture, which was named Captain. "We will take that under advisement," Frederick said. Ruth continued teaching through May, because the school year ended then and her condition was not yet visible enough to require explanation, and because she was not going to leave her students without warning. She finished the school year in good health and good spirits, and the community, which noticed these things, offered the kind of practical community support that the frontier was actually quite good at when it put its mind to it. Extra provisions, offers of help, the school board's promise that her position would be held for her through the following year if she needed time. In September of 1879, Ruth delivered a healthy boy. He weighed 8 pounds and 3 ounces and had Frederick's dark hair and Ruth's direct, bright eyes, and he announced his arrival in the world with a considerable volume that suggested he would be a person of strong opinions. They named him Thomas Henry Dalton. Not after Pearl's admired horse or June's list of 20 possibilities. and not after a star, though Pearl accepted the star option being declined with more grace than expected when Ruth gently explained that stars deserve to keep their own names. Thomas Henry, for Frederick's father and Ruth's grandfather, two solid and decent men who had never known each other but who shared the quality that Frederick and Ruth most wanted this boy to carry into the world. The house, already full, became fuller in the very best way. Thomas was a cheerful and demanding infant who managed to charm everyone around him with a thoroughness that suggested he understood the project instinctively. Maggie, at 11, took her role as eldest sibling with great seriousness and proved to be a remarkably competent helper in ways that allowed Ruth genuine rest during the harder early weeks. June appointed herself the baby's primary entertainer and spent considerable hours talking to him about lizards, which Thomas received with apparent interest. Pearl sat beside the cradle every morning and told Thomas the stories Ruth had told her, with her own elaborations added, and Thomas watched her face with the focused attention of an infant who has found his person. Frederick watched his family, the whole shape of it, all of them in the warm kitchen or the evening lamplight or the wide September yard, and felt something so large and complete that it made him quiet in the way that only very great things make a person quiet. He went behind the barn one evening in October, the same patch of dirt where he had knelt 14 months before, and he went down on his knees again. But this time it was not a prayer of asking. It was a prayer of the other kind entirely, the kind where you have nothing to request and everything to offer, and you simply try to say thank you in a way that is big enough to match the thing you are grateful for, which is never possible, but which is worth attempting. He stayed there on his knees in the dirt for a long time, with the Texas sky going enormous and dark and starred above him, and the sound of his house full of living people coming to him across the dark air. Then he stood up, dusted his trousers, put his hat on, and went back inside to his family. Life on the ranch in Haskell County moved forward with the kind of steady, layered richness that is different from adventure and drama, but is not less. It is the richness of real things, the daily work and the seasonal rhythms, the conversations at supper and the quiet evenings, the children growing and changing and becoming more themselves with each passing year. Maggie Dalton, at 12 and 13 and 14, was becoming a person of such focused intelligence and clear purpose that both Frederick and Ruth looked at her sometimes with a kind of awed respect. She was going to go somewhere with it, that intelligence. She was going to do something that mattered. They could both see it, and they discussed it quietly, seriously, as something they wanted to support and not in any way limit. June remained June, vivid and curious and absolutely herself. Her illustrated journal of lizard drawings had evolved into a more comprehensive natural history of the Haskell County region, which she continued to expand, and which Ruth, reading it one afternoon, declared to be genuinely excellent work that deserved to be published one day. June received this with the calm of someone who had always privately agreed with the assessment but was glad to have it confirmed. Pearl grew into a storyteller. This surprised no one who had known her. She had been telling stories since she could speak, embellishing and inventing and expanding every experience into something larger and more vivid. And by the time she was 8, she had a gift for it that was entirely original and entirely her own. Ruth cultivated it with the careful attention of a teacher who recognizes a real thing when she sees it, giving Pearl books and time, and the specific kind of encouragement that is not flattery but honest recognition. Thomas grew into his cheerful, strong-opinioned self with the additional quality of being remarkably physical, a child who climbed everything and ran everywhere and who, by the age of 2, could manage a fence post better than most children twice his age, which Frederick observed with a private pride he tried not to make too visible and mostly succeeded. In the spring of 1881, Ruth told Frederick she was expecting again. This time he was not still at all. He picked her up, which she was not expecting and which made her produce a sound of undignified surprise that delighted him. "Frederick," she said. "Ruth," he said, holding her off the ground with complete ease. "Put me down," she said. "In a moment," he said. He set her down and she straightened her hair and gave him a look of magnificent dignity and was clearly trying not to laugh and entirely failing. "Two is a great many children," she said when she had composed herself. "You have 3 stepdaughters," he pointed out. "That is different," she said. "Is it?" She looked at him and her expression softened into something warm and completely unguarded. "No," she said. "I suppose it is not." She put her hand against his cheek. "I am very happy about it, in case that was unclear." "It was not unclear," he said, "but I am glad to hear it anyway." Their second child, born in November of 1881, was a girl. She came into the world in the early morning hours with considerably more drama than Thomas had managed, but arrived healthy and loud and clearly determined to make her presence known. They named her Clara Ruth Dalton, for Clara who was gone and Ruth who was here, for the past and the present and the particular grace of a life that can hold both. Pearl, who had been hoping for a sister for 2 years, took one look at Clara Ruth in her mother's arms and burst into tears of complete joy, which frightened Thomas briefly and caused June to pat Pearl on the shoulder with the practical comfort of a sibling who understands but also finds excessive emotion slightly alarming. Maggie sat beside Ruth on the bed and looked at the new baby with the expression she reserved for things that struck her as both important and beautiful, which was a very particular expression, very quiet and very deep. "She looks like Mama," Maggie said. And then immediately, "Is that strange to say?" Ruth looked at her stepdaughter, this serious, brilliant girl she had come to love with a fullness that had arrived not all at once but steadily and completely over 3 years. "No," Ruth said. "It is not strange at all. Tell me what you remember about her." And Maggie did, right there on the bed with the new baby between them, in a quiet voice that held all of it carefully, and it was the kindest thing anyone had done for Maggie Dalton in a very long time, to simply be a person she could tell those things to. By 1882, the Dalton ranch had expanded. Frederick had purchased an additional 60 acres to the north, which gave him enough range to increase the herd substantially. He had also invested in better equipment and hired 2 hands, a young man named Will Greer who was 18 and hardworking, and who boarded in the small bunkhouse Frederick had built, and an older man named Silas who had worked cattle for 30 years and who had no opinions about anything except cattle management, which he had very many opinions about. The school in Larson's Creek had grown too. Ruth returned to teaching each year, and the school board had, over 4 years, provided 2 additional rooms and a small library of books funded by a combination of county money and community contribution. Ruth had written the grant letter for the library books herself, and it had been so precisely and compellingly composed that the county education board had funded it at twice the requested amount, and sent a letter commenting that it was the best proposal they had received in 10 years. Frederick read the letter when it arrived and said, with complete sincerity, "Have you considered running for the school board?" "Absolutely not," Ruth said. "I am a teacher, not a politician." "The two are not mutually exclusive," he said. "In my case they are," she said serenely. "I have too direct a way of disagreeing with people to be effective in a committee." He laughed. He was laughing more in these years than he had in the decade before, which was not something he had expected to quantify when he was 34 and alone, and running a ranch with 3 young daughters and a great deal of quiet grief. He had not expected to be, at 39, a man who laughed often and easily, and who went to bed each night beside a woman he was still discovering new things about, and who surprised him still, regularly, with the particular quality of her mind and the particular constancy of her character. Ruth was 35 in 1884, and she had been Ruth Dalton for 6 years, and she was different from the woman who had knocked on Frederick's door in September of 1877 in the ways that 6 years change a person, deeper in some ways, more rooted, more herself rather than less. She had built something real in Larson's Creek, a school that was genuinely good, a community she was genuinely part of. She had built something real at the ranch, a family that was genuinely hers, 5 children who were genuinely hers in the way that children are yours when you have loved them without condition through their growing. Frederick, at 41, was different too. Older and more weathered, and the gray at his temples had become a proper gray throughout, which Ruth had declared on various occasions to be extremely distinguished, which he had accepted with the dignified skepticism it deserved. But there was something in him that was not harder but softer in the right ways, the ways that come to a man when he has been loved well by a good woman for long enough that the love has become as structural as the bones of him, built into the way he stands and moves and speaks and looks at the world. Maggie turned 17 in 1885, and had by then been reading at a level that Ruth described honestly as beyond anything she could teach her. Frederick and Ruth had a long and serious conversation that spring about what came next for Maggie, because it was apparent to both of them that this girl needed more than Haskell County could currently offer, and that the question of how to provide it required careful navigation. There was a women's college in Waco. Ruth knew of it, had written to them on Maggie's behalf, and received back a letter indicating that Maggie's application for the fall of 1886 would be very favorably considered, particularly given the strength of her reading and the quality of the written work sample Ruth had included. Frederick read the letter 3 times. He thought about the money, which was a real consideration and required adjustment to the ranch's finances in ways he spent 2 weeks working out. He thought about Maggie, 17, his firstborn, the girl who had taken such fierce care of her sisters and carried such gravity in her eyes, Maggie who deserved every good thing the world could offer. He said yes. Maggie received the news at the kitchen table one evening after supper, all the family around, Thomas and Pearl and June and little Clara Ruth in her chair, and Frederick and Ruth across the table from her. Ruth had the letter in her hand. Maggie read it twice. She set it down on the table very carefully in the way she did things when she was feeling something large and was keeping it organized. Then she looked at her father. "Are you certain?" she asked. "It is a great deal of money." "I am certain," Frederick said. Maggie looked at Ruth. "Did you write this letter?" "I wrote the application," Ruth said. "You wrote the essay. I edited only the grammar." Maggie was silent for another moment. Then something cracked open in her face, and the gravity was still there, but behind it was something luminous, the brightness that had been softening into it for 6 years, the thing that had been waiting for room to become itself. She started crying, which Maggie Dalton almost never did, and it was the particular crying of someone who has been holding something very tightly for a very long time and has just been told they can put it down. Frederick came around the table and put his arms around his eldest daughter and held her, and Pearl immediately plastered herself against Maggie's other side, and June put a hand on Maggie's shoulder, and Thomas, at 6, climbed up onto his chair to be at a better height for observation, and Clara Ruth banged her spoon on the tray of her chair in support. Ruth sat at the table and watched Frederick hold his daughters and felt the fullness of it, this life, this whole and real and complicated and beautiful life, all of it assembled piece by piece from the rubble of grief and the patience of years and one wagon wheel that broke at exactly the right moment. The years of the late 1880s moved with the particular momentum of a life well established and continuing to build. June at 20 was apprenticing with the county surveyor, who had recognized in her the specific combination of visual precision and detailed observation that made her natural for the work, and who paid her a modest wage that she spent almost entirely on books and drawing supplies. June was also, quietly and in her own time, in the early stages of a correspondence with a young man from the surveyor's office whose name was Daniel, who was 22, and who appeared to have good values and a sense of humor, and an appreciation for lizard illustrations that suggested he might survive a serious attachment to June Dalton with his equanimity intact. Ruth and Frederick observed this development with interested calm, and made no comment unless June brought it up, which she occasionally did, with the practical straightforwardness that was the family trait. Pearl at 15 was writing stories in every available moment and had filled 4 notebooks with them, each one more technically accomplished and more emotionally rich than the last. Ruth read them with the same honest attention she gave to everything Pearl brought her, and her response was always specific and true. What worked, what could be better, what showed genuine originality. Pearl received this feedback with the focused seriousness of a person who understands that the difference between encouragement and instruction is the difference between feeling good and getting better, and she wanted to get better. Thomas at 7 was a force of nature in the very best sense, running the ranch alongside his father with an eagerness that was both endearing and operationally useful, because Thomas had an instinct for cattle and horses that was going to be enormously valuable in about 10 years, and Frederick said so, which made Thomas stand an inch taller. Clara Ruth at 8 was the family's wild card, utterly her own person, with a boldness that was all her own and a laugh that could fill a room and a temper that arrived and departed like a summer storm. She was also, when she chose to be, capable of a stillness and a sweetness that stopped people in their tracks. She was going to be something formidable, Ruth told Frederick privately, and Frederick, who had raised 3 daughters and was now raising a 4th, said that he was aware of this and was already planning for it. In the autumn of 1889, Maggie came home from Waco with her certificate from the college and a letter of acceptance to teach at the school in Waco itself, which was one of the finest girls' schools in that part of Texas. She was 21 years old and composed and brilliant and still serious in the specific way that was hers, though the gravity had long since been joined by a warmth that had been growing in it since the year Ruth came. Frederick and Ruth drove to Waco to collect her, just the 2 of them, leaving the younger children with Will Greer's wife, who had married Will 3 years prior, and who was a practical and reliable young woman who the children adored. They made the drive as a kind of expedition together, just the 2 of them on the wagon seat through 3 days of Texas landscape, and they talked the whole way and were quiet the whole way in the comfortable, easy alternation of people who have been genuinely intimate for 11 years. They brought Maggie home for 2 weeks before she went back to Waco for her new position. 2 weeks at the ranch, full house, all the children, the table crowded at every meal, the loft loud with voices and the kitchen warm with constant activity. Maggie and Ruth sat at the kitchen table together the last evening before Frederick drove Maggie to the stage road, and Maggie said something she had been working up to for a while. "I want to thank you," Maggie said. She was direct in the way her father was direct, always had been. "For everything, for writing that letter, for reading everything I ever put in front of you, for taking us seriously." She paused. "For being here." Ruth looked at her stepdaughter, this brilliant, serious, warm young woman who had been 9 years old when she came through Frederick's front door, and who was now 21 and going out to make something extraordinary of herself. "You did the work," Ruth said. "Every bit of it." "I know," Maggie said, "but you showed me what the work was for." That was the moment Ruth Dalton allowed herself to cry, which she did not do often, and which she did now with characteristic economy, quickly and completely and without making a great deal of it. Then she pressed her handkerchief back into her pocket and poured them both more coffee, and they talked about Waco, and the school, and the students Maggie expected to have, and the books she was planning to assign. And it was a conversation between 2 educators and 2 people who respected each other completely. And it was one of the finest conversations Ruth Dalton had in her entire life. The next morning, Frederick loaded Maggie's bags onto the wagon and drove her to the stage road, and Ruth stood on the porch of the house with the younger children around her to wave them off, and Pearl had her arm around Clara Ruth, and Thomas stood straight and tall beside them. And June was there too, home for the day to say goodbye to her sister. Frederick came back alone in the late afternoon, and Ruth met him on the porch, and he sat down in his chair, and she sat beside him, and they were quiet together for a while, the way they did the big things, together and without pretense. "She is going to be remarkable," Ruth said. "She already is," Frederick said. They sat on the porch in the September light. The ranch spread around them, the house behind them warm and full, and somewhere in the north pasture Thomas could be heard engaged in an argument with the fence about something. And Pearl's voice came from her room through the open window, composing something out loud in the serious, rhythmic cadence she used when she was working. And Clara Ruth could be heard down by the barn talking to the horses with the confident authority of someone who expects to be listened to. Frederick looked out at his land, 460 acres of hard, beautiful Texas flatland under the enormous sky, and then at the woman beside him, who was reading a letter from the county school board about next year's curriculum and making small sounds of disagreement at the relevant points. "Ruth," he said. She looked up. "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. At the red hair that had a silver thread in it now, at the direct brown eyes and the strong cheekbones and the line of her jaw, at this woman who had appeared at his door 12 years ago with a broken wagon wheel and a saddlebag, and the kind of forthright honesty that had made everything after possible. "I prayed for help," he said. She understood the reference immediately. She always did. And she said, "I think the answer was somewhat more generous than the request," he said. Ruth Sawyer Dalton looked at her husband in the September light and felt the full weight and warmth of 12 years and 5 children and one broken wagon wheel and a prayer said behind a barn in the afternoon dirt. And she smiled, slowly and completely, the way she always had, the smile that went all the way to her eyes. "I think," she said, "that the most important prayers are the ones that get answered differently than you expected, because you only ever know what you need. You do not always know what you want." Frederick reached over and took her hand, the way he had taken it the first time on an October afternoon outside of Larson's Creek, and she closed her fingers around his, the way she always did, without hesitation. The Texas sky was enormous and blue above them. The house was full and warm behind them. The land stretched out in every direction, steady and beautiful and entirely theirs. Pearl's voice came again through the window, telling her story to no one in particular, shaping the world out of words the way she always had. And Clara Ruth's laughter rose up from the direction of the barn, clear and wild and joyful. And somewhere Frederick's cattle moved in the late afternoon pasture, and the wind came through the tall grass the way it always did in September, warm and golden and smelling of everything that was good about this place and this life. Frederick and Ruth sat together on the porch of the house they had made a home, in the last long light of the afternoon, holding on to each other with the easy, unshakable certainty of people who know exactly where they are and exactly where they belong. And they were quiet and they were together, and they were, in every way that mattered, completely and fully and irreversibly home.